Hello everyone, I'm welcoming you to the sixth lecture of our series for this year, the sixth cycle of our lecture series in Late Antiquity, when our world became Christian. It's a huge pleasure to have as a guest tonight a leading scholar in late Attic studies, Professor Johannes Hahn. I will start with a short introduction, and then we will listen to him for about 45 minutes or so, and then there will be questions. As you know, our routine, during the questions, the recording will be stopped. Before we begin, a very important important change in our program. Our next lecture will take place on the 15th of May by Professor Agosti, who is also online, and he's watching us. So we have a change in our program. Our next lecture will be on the 15th of May, also Thursday. So, a few words for our special guest tonight. Professor Dr. Johannes Hahn, born in 1957, studied philosophy, history, and classical archaeology in Munich, Heidelberg, Oxford, and Berlin, where he graduated with an MA in philosophy in 1982. He has been an assistant professor at the University of Heidelberg since 1982, where he received his doctorate in ancient history in 1986 and his habilitation in 1993. After teaching at the University of Erfurt, Cologne, and Freiburg, he was appointed full professor at the University of Münster in 1996. This was followed by visiting professors in Princeton, Erlangen, Budapest, and Nijmegen. The University of Budapest awarded him the title of Doctor et Professor Honoris Causa in May 2021. To the tribe of late antique scholars, Professor Hahn is perhaps best known for his seminal monograph on religious conflict and violence of 2002, and the collected volume titled From the Temple to Church, Destruction and Renewal of Local Cultic Topography in Late Antiquity. But over the years, he has also contributed a pleiad of monographs and important articles in the field. After that, the title of tonight's paper is Revolutionizing Christian Communication with the Divine, Martyrs and their Veneration in Late Antiquity. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Georgios, for introducing me and even more for inviting me to this lecture series. I'm glad that I'm able to speak for the first time in my life in Cyprus, unfortunately only digitally, but still it's a pleasure to me, and I hope that my today's talk will convince you of a new view on late antique martyrdom and its function. And so I start with my first slide, and what you see here is celebrating feasts as in ancient Rome. This would certainly be a suitable title for a popular description of Roman everyday culture. Allusions like those in this painting by Lawrence Alma-Tadema, the great historical painter of the late 19th century, immediately come to mind. Loud festive joy, people celebrating, including women and children in the streets, priests, music, singing, spectators. At the same time, the picture lacks such important elements of Roman festivities as the banquet with opulent food, drink, jugglers, and other entertainers. And this does not even include the games that are so characteristic of Roman festive culture: chariot races, animal chases, gladiator fights, etc., each framed by religious ceremonies. Roman festivals as a whole which filled the calendar of the Republic and the imperial period with an impressive number and density and structured the year for the population, are, however, not the subject of my lecture. And yet it makes sense to sketch the social and communicative significance of such festivities. I'll present you with an example of the festivities donated by a single person to his fellow citizens in an Italian town in the 1st century AD immediately. Against this background, I'll then develop the problem of Christian festivals as a means of religious communication. Christian festivals, which, since the reign of Constantine, that means in late antiquity, were also celebrated in public and were directed in the same way at the population of a town. This analysis will then lead us to the main focus of this lecture, the role and significance of the veneration of martyrs for the festival culture of the late antique church, especially in the 4th century, but also in the following centuries. The structure of my talk you can see here. So let us first have a look at Pompeii, at an extraordinary inscription that has come to light only recently in 2017. At this point, I can also show you some images, which you will have to do without in the rest of the lecture. The text, with 183 words, by far the longest tomb inscription found so far in Pompeii, sheds a remarkable light on the festival culture in a Roman city of the early imperial period. The text, you see how it was found during the excavation, or rather reparation work, at the administrative center of the archaeological park in Pompeii. And this text now at this tomb reports on a series of extraordinary acts of benefactions by an unknown local dignitary, which began with a banquet. I'll give you the English text later as well. You don't have to understand every word of the Latin. It had started with a banquet, and on the occasion of his coming of age, and it seems continued into his adult life until the last years of the city, 79 AD, when the monument was erected. Yes, this inscription, which seems to allude to, no, I have to go back, sorry for this. This inscription provides valuable, if ambivalent, new information on the demographic, economic, and social history of Pompeii. From the inscription, which lists a whole spectrum of beneficia of our anonymous donor and municipal dignitary, it is immediately obvious what outstanding importance the feast, Epulum, mentioned in the first place had, even if it was not the most costly element of the donations in terms of expenditure. We can hardly imagine its impact on the public life of the city to be great enough. Almost 6,500 people were publicly fed at the same time, something that was possible only in a few places in Pompeii, perhaps on the Forum alone. Even with the tricline set up most densely, a space of at least 100 to 100 meters was needed. The self-perception of the citizenry in this setting, no matter which groups we imagine here as dining participants, must have been extraordinary. The identity-forming power of this communal meal, financed by an individual, or undoubtedly more accurately by one of the leading families of the city, a ritual of social bonds, the sense of communitas conveyed here, all the more so in connection with the presumed previous pompa, a splendid public procession, can hardly be overestimated. The following visit to the gladiator fights in Pompeii's amphitheater will have been just as impressive for the participants. In the amphitheater, which had room for about 20,000 people, who here, arranged according to social status, followed the events together and celebrated the occasion, the donor of the game, and not least, of course, themselves. Celebrating together. This was a fundamental expression of the collective identity that united the Pompeians as citizens, or simply as inhabitants of their city and its environs, whether with or without citizenship rights, regardless of whether these celebrations were carried out on the basis of the city's festive calendar or organized by members of the local elite for personal reasons or political motives, for example, during election campaigns, or whether they were financed by professional associations and organized in public. Other cult communities also enriched public life with their processions and festivities, and at the same time competed with each other in public perception. At this point, however, I break off my sketch of festival culture in the urban world of the Imperium Romanum, and not go into further detail on rituals and other religious practices that were performed in various contexts and by different cult groups. The sketch serves only as a background foil against which peculiar and historically powerful features of Christian celebration in this festive environment can be better understood. For this, let us follow the testimony of a well-known ancient contemporary. In 111 AD, the younger Pliny, a high-ranking Roman senator who administered the province of Pontus and Bithynia on the Black Sea, felt compelled to send a detailed report to his emperor, Trajan. In it, he reported on the rituals of a religious group that had caused considerable unrest in provincial society. Pliny's famous letter summarizes the results of his detailed investigations, but with rather modest findings. The Christians, he wrote to Rome, were in the habit of gathering, I quote, on a certain day before sunrise, singing a reciprocal chant to Christ as their God, and taking a mutual oath, quote end, in which they committed themselves to ethical behavior. His interviews further revealed, I quote again, after that they disperse and come together again later in the day to eat food, but ordinary, harmless food. And even these meals they would have given up immediately after he had forbidden them. These few pieces of information obtained from the interrogation of Christians are so important because they allow a precious insight into the life of the early church. It is only towards the end of the 2nd century that we get a fairly clear picture of the liturgy and the inner life of the post-apostolic church, based then on the writings of Tertullian and Justin, that means Christian authors. At the time of Pliny, Christians were largely hidden from public perception. Worship, communication, and congregational life took place shielded from the uninitiated, as it suited a mystery cult. In the case of the Christians, this happened even in the seclusion of private houses, a circumstance that was not to change until the Constantinian transition 2 centuries later. Then, however, Christianity suddenly found itself in the public eye. It had now to celebrate its services in places of worship open to the public. These basilicas, often imperial foundations, in memoriae specific communal structures that were built in the cemeteries on the outskirts of the cities. The celebrations of the Christians became perceivable, visible, audible. However, the attractiveness of this congregational life, I'm talking here not about the Christian message, the spiritual power or religious content of this doctrine of salvation. This attractiveness was limited, all the more so in a world that, as we've seen before, was characterized by a multitude of festivals and holidays. The Sunday service, with its liturgy and the following communal meal, failed to impress not only the younger Pliny. Above all, however, at the time of the Constantinian transition, there existed, in fact, still no Christian festival cycle, and it remained rudimentary in the course of the 4th century. Only slowly did it take on the contours and form with which we are familiar. The period leading up to Easter, the later Quadragesima or Lent, was a penitential period lacking in joyful activities anyway. The Easter Vigil was only extended to a Holy Week, with Good Friday, Maundy Thursday evening, and Holy Saturday in a process of deliberate historizing. Christmas and the Epiphany, in turn, only became established and spread in the 4th century. Above all, pagan festivals were the inspiration for their development in a revealing way. The Christmas festival, as the day of Christ's birth, originated as a counterpart to a pagan imperial holiday, the Dies Natalis Solis Invicti, the birthday festival of the invincible sun god, and was celebrated by the Church on precisely this feast day, December 25, in order to displace or absorb the cult of the sun god. The feast of the Epiphany also borrowed from a pagan model. As a Christian counterpart to the birthday of Ion, a syncretic deity, it was first celebrated in Constantinian times in Alexandria. The ecclesiastical festive season of Advent only came into being in the course of the 4th century and was aimed at representing a period of preparation for the Christmas festival, which was rapidly gaining in popularity, comparable to the Easter period of Lent. The now increasingly emphasized ruler quality of Christ could also be emphasized in this way: Adventus, the ruler's arrival. All in all, it must be said that the Christian liturgy and the Christian festive calendar largely only emerged in the course of the 4th century, after the Constantinian transition. The festive calendar of the Church is a product of late antiquity and had to unfold slowly here, not least in confrontation with the pagan and equally lively and formative Jewish environment. It should be noted that the rapid developments within the Church just outlined had to be established, received, and celebrated in local Christian communities with their own, albeit modest, liturgical traditions. Long before the Constantinian transition, the Church had already been confronted with the problem of a limited festive calendar, but above all, with a modest festive culture that could in no way compete with the pagan and civil cultures and their customs, and also with unhappy behavior on the part of Christian parishioners who were not satisfied with this festive culture. As early as 196 AD, the apologist Tertullian complained that Christians took part in the Saturnalia, the calends of January, the New Year's festival, the Brumalia, the Matronalia, etc. That means Roman festivals celebrated throughout the empire and each lasting several days. And they took part in the exchange of gifts customary at pagan festivals. Yet he adds, pagans would never celebrate Christian holidays in a similar way. And he expresses indignantly, as if we Christians did not have enough feast days. On every 8th day, they have a solemnitas, a Sunday celebration. And in addition, the Pentecost, the 50 days period of joy after Easter. A remarkable aspect of Tertullian's polemic, his writing De Idolatria seeks to discourage Christians from idol worship, is that he nevertheless does not object to participation in certain family celebrations, such as the conferring of the toga virilis, the so-called sumptio toga virilis, or the sponsalia, the betrothal feast, the nuptialia, wedding feast, or the nominalia, naming feast, despite the religious acts involved. The apologist also deliberately ignores the fact that these family celebrations as well included parades, extensive feasts with meat and alcohol, gifts of money, a broad entertainment program, and much more. But beyond the question of the formation of a festive calendar, something else must be noted. We are probably not wrong in assuming that Christian worship in general was not marked by joyful participation or exuberant hilarity. Even in his Christmas sermon, John Chrysostom, the charismatic preacher and later Bishop of Constantinople, rejected cheers in Christian festivity. He warned his listeners against unseemly exuberance and urged them to exercise restraint. When receiving communion, he demanded the soul should be of serene calm. His sermons on the occasion of Christian feasts, which have been handed down to us, turn to a guide to strict Christian feast practice. John Chrysostom's theory of feasts, and not only his, the Cappadocian church fathers Gregory and Basilius, for example, are in nowhere inferior to him in this respect. This theory is characterized by remarkable soberness. Chrysostom wants the Christian festivals on earth to be understood as an anticipation of the serene tranquility of the heavenly Jerusalem, in deliberate distinction from the hilarity and immorality of pagan festivals. However, there is reason to doubt that this uncompromising emphasis on the spirituality of the Christian message developed convincing persuasiveness beyond a hardcore of congregation members. The preacher's attempt to generate a thorough Christian identity among his audience repeatedly met with massive opposition within his own congregation. John's vision of a Christian city, his pastoral agenda of countering the annual rhythm of urban festivals with a Christian festival culture as an answer and alternative, proved ineffective. Our preacher met pious Christian pilgrims who the day before had visited a martyr's shrine, a little later among the joyful visitors of a public festival in the Grove of Daphne, the important pagan sacred precinct of Antioch. The dominance and popularity of the pagan festival culture, even if it had largely lost its religious content, was evident. The traditions preserved here, with their clear and dense temporal division of the year, far superior to the Christian liturgical calendar. The power of the games and of the celebration culture of the pagan environment was so overwhelming that polemics against it became the standard repertoire of Christian authors and preachers. Time and again, the believers were made aware of the dangers to their salvation that were associated with attending the festivities of their environment. It may be understandable that Tertullian, around 200 AD, at a time when Christians were still a small group in the population, wrote a treatise on games, De Spectaculis, directed to the members of the churches in North Africa in order to dissuade them from attending the games and to keep away from the pagans. But it is perhaps more surprising that almost 2 centuries later, under Emperor Theodosius, the Christianissimus Imperator, John Chrysostom has to devote himself to the same subject, all the more so in the pastoral situation which he takes as his occasion. During Lent, he teaches the candidates for baptism for the upcoming Easter feast in a cycle of catechesis, the basics of the Christian faith and the meaning of baptism. One of the 7 catecheses, it is number 5, he begins with the words, I quote, "There are horse races and satanic games again, and already our assembly is smaller. Since I already feared this, I called upon you not to be infected by the disgracefulness of satanic performances. It seems that this exhortation has been of no avail." Quote end. His entire sermon is now devoted to the de facto denial of the Christian message of salvation through neglect of the rules of conduct prescribed for devout Christians. Not only the traditional pagan festivals, whose religious roots had often become meaningless in late antiquity, represented a challenge to the Christian church. Other religious groups also celebrated festivals that attracted public attention and could develop a strong appeal in local societies. It is revealing that this fact can be deduced from Christian sources, which polemically deal with the appearance and impact of other religious communities. In the marketplace of religions, as John North aptly put it, numerous groups competed and tried to win over followers. Festivals were an important instrument here. In the Syrian metropolis of Antioch, one of the most important and populous cities of the empire, it was the city's Jewish community that attracted people from all circles of society with its festivals. As a young cleric, John Chrysostom experienced this attraction as an existential threat to the Antiochian church. In view of the impending Jewish festival cycle during the late summer of the year 386, he interrupted a series of sermons in order to preach a string of 8 sermons to warn his flock against fraternizing with their Jewish fellow citizens, or more accurately, to prevent them from doing so. In the first place, his statements document a striking extent of Christian-Jewish coexistence in Antioch. The awareness of the fundamental difference between the Jewish and Christian faiths and the symbolic content of the respective religious practices was lost on many Christians, and Judaizing tendencies among them called into question the identity of the church and its faith. This Judaizing, Judaizein in Greek, was not limited to aspects of straight religious practice, but permeated more areas of life. Christians confirmed business relationships by taking oaths in the synagogue, as these were said to be more effective. In case of illness, they called Jewish doctors for help, or obtained magic potions and amulets made by Jews. Incubation in front of the Torah shrine of the synagogue of Daphne, the summer resort of Antioch, was a common custom also among members of the Christian community. Above all, however, Chrysostom's congregation members attended the Jewish festivals, shared consecrated food and drink with their hosts, took part in the festivities, dances, etc. And they practiced nothing less than religious fellowship with the Jews of their city when they participated in the Jewish fast, or even had themselves circumcised according to Jewish rites. In his anti-Jewish sermons, John uses all the devices and polemical techniques of contemporary rhetoric to defame the Jews. He denounces their synagogues as dens of vice and breeding grounds for soul-destroying demons, denigrates the Jewish believers as blasphemers, and portrays the Jewish religious festivals in glaring colors as stages of moral and sexual debauchery. The frustration, even selective despair, which speaks from Chrysostom's, sorry, I have to continue. The frustration, even selective despair, which speaks from some of Chrysostom's sermons, points to a deeper, even structural problem of the Christianization process in the Roman Empire after the Constantinian transition. This historic turn had unexpectedly brought Christianity not only legalization and recognition by the Roman state, but also massive support from the emperor. However, the dynamic development that now began to make Christianity the majority religion, and soon after even the state religion, transformed the Christian church into a mass movement of totally new character. Previously, joining had required a serious and momentous decision of faith, momentous also socially. In view of the illegality of Christianity and sporadic state persecution, this also implied an incalculable personal risk. The influx of new members had the consequence now that large numbers of new Christians populated the congregations who were only superficially familiar with Christian beliefs and ethical values, and who continued to adhere to pagan customs and ideas. Not a few of them even converted to Christianity for opportunistic reasons. The strong inner bond of pre-Constantine congregations, a decisive feature of that identity, was lost. Pastoral access was also markedly weakened, since suitable meeting buildings, churches that could have accommodated the quickly growing congregations were lacking. This is now an enormously huge field, and I can only sketch it here. I just want to point out one aspect, that in this period, in the 4th century, we find, in a way, the invention of what we call in German, I translate it into English, the Christmas Christians. That means Christians that turn up just once a year in the church and to follow, well, the Christmas liturgy, but nothing else. And John Chrysostom testifies exactly for this. Christian sources in the 4th century hardly ever reflect this, probably because they already anticipate the later success of Christianity in this period. But indeed, the developments in the church are much more diverse, and this is partly what I want to show you later too. You can see these problems within the church now in the 4th century, for instance, in the debates about so-called half-Christians, semi-Christians. And what we see here is that Christians clearly had multiple identities. So they may have chosen to convert to Christianity, but it did not mean that they gave up their former pagan practices completely. They still went to particular cults for particular purposes. So it was not an exclusive Christian identity many of them accepted with their baptism. So in a way, what we can now recognize, in my view, is that the Constantinian transition, in my understanding, is, besides the persecutions suffered before, the biggest crisis of the church now, because this identity I just characterized, the former pre-Constantinian identity, this was threatened to erode now. It was an enormous turnover in this post-Constantinian church, and I call this a major crisis. The Constantinian transition is of direct relevance to our topic also in a completely different way. In fact, with the turning point, the Christian church gained a new frame of reference for lived Christian piety, and at the same time, new places and forms of Christian celebration. When we speak of the religion's innovations initiated by Emperor Constantine, that is, the beginnings of an imperial church, the introduction of empire-wide church councils, the promotion, indeed the invention of the Holy Land, the building of churches, and the Holy Land including pilgrimage, etc., then perhaps the best known element of this religious political agenda, the so-called Constantinian church building program, as the material basis for the flourishing of the church in the 4th century, needs to be critically questioned at this point. I would like to show you now that this church building program, in the narrower sense, as well as in its concrete material meaning, did not exist at all. But that would mean another lecture. What is decisive for us here is that those Constantinian places of worship, we can grasp a total of a good 24 in the entire empire, were primarily a commitarial, it is cemetery church, not a congregational church building program. They were therefore primarily intended to commemorate the dead and allow for their veneration. This can already be seen in Rome. Sorry, I have to go back. I seem to, can already be seen in Rome, where 1/3 of all Constantinian church buildings in the whole of the empire were erected. Only the church on the Lateran, number 1, was built as a parish church on city ground and then served as Rome's episcopal church. All the other churches were located at or in the middle of the cemeteries aside the major roads leading out of the city. And not to forget, several of them also served as imperial cult buildings, housed the tombs of members of Constantine's family, and liturgically commemorated these special individuals as well. Now, the care of the dead practiced in the cemeteries at the graves of the deceased, with their memorial meals for them, became the powerful basis of a popular culture of piety and celebration in the 4th century. Its beginnings lie in the increased care for the dead of the Christians. This was followed in a further step by the organization of liturgical commemorations for the martyrs who had fallen victim to the persecutions of Christians in the decades before. The importance of the martyr cult, which developed in the second half of the 3rd century for the spread of Christianity in the 4th century, cannot be overestimated. By far the majority of church buildings in the 4th century were monumentalized martyrs' tombs, so-called martyria. In North African Carthage, for example, there was only one small church building in the city, with room for 300 people at most. On the periphery, outside the city walls, on the other hand, there were several large basilicas, some of which had a capacity of thousands, together for probably 10 to 15,000 faithful. In Egypt, the Coptic monk Shenuti, one of the harshest critics of the worship of martyrs, observed that in view of the construction of more and more new martyr chapels, the actual churches were no longer visited. In these, he explained, peacocks and guinea fowls were spreading. This finding reflects several fundamental developments of Christianity in the 4th century. Above all, a new material Christian culture that brought to the fore the connection of the divine, the sacred, now with places and objects. A notion unthinkable in early Christianity, indeed fiercely fought against. The new Christian need to experience holiness with the senses in a downright physical way, a need felt above all by new converts with their roots in pagan cult practice and its religious rituals and materiality. This was reflected in the development of the liturgy, in the new basilical worship spaces, and precious sacred equipment, etc. And above all, in the veneration of martyrs and its design. I'll give an example and quote. That's a pity. There's one slide missing, so please listen to it. I quote Gregory of Nyssa from his sermon on the martyr Theodore. He writes, "Every believer immediately desires to approach the barrier at the tomb, believing that touching it signifies sanctification and blessing. And if he is allowed to take the dust as it was deposited at the enclosure of the martyr's resting place, the dust is regarded as a gift and the earth is kept like a treasure. But that the touching of the remains itself, if it only becomes possible by some happy chance, is longed for, and the fulfillment of the highest desire is known by those who have experienced it and have satisfied this longing. For as when the body was still alive and flourishing, so those who see it embrace it. They approach him with their eyes, their mouths, their ears, with all their senses, then shed tears of veneration and pain over the martyr, as if he were still in an unchanged state, and implore him for his intercession." So you realize this is a polysensory experience to enter a martyrion and to see the martyr in his sarcophagus or in his shrine. In the martyrion, the often modest burial place of a martyr, however, not only the official annual feasts of the saint took place, which were designed and celebrated by clerics and thus controlled by the church. A martyrium was also a place of personal encounter with the martyr. It was a sacred place, a place where, in the words of Peter Brown, heaven and earth met. Here, the faithful, visitors here on earth, could not only venerate the martyr present in his relics, but address him already in heaven, in order to bring him to intercession with God. Preachers urged their parishioners to visit the martyrs in their shrines at all times. On this occasion, as John Chrysostom explains, and I quote, "They may throw themselves on the relics. They may embrace the shrine in which the martyrs rest. These shrines, like the bones of the martyrs themselves, also contain great power." The request for direct intercession with God now puts the faithful in direct communication, creates a close relationship between the faithful and the martyr that escapes further control by the church. Even if the countless sermons on martyrs that have been handed down to us try to prescribe forms and contents of the veneration of martyrs, wanting to present the martyr to Christian believers above all as a model of shining Christian virtue. the form of this communication of the faithful with a martyr at his or her grave and other places, whether by carrying a relic or by possessing an eulogium, a pilgrimage souvenir, the use of flower or libation offerings, the festive encounter with the saint at his or her burial site, or in the cemetery, or at the alleged place of his or her execution, this communication was therefore a very personal, individual one. In the shaping of the close relationship into which a multitude of factors could be involved, Christian identity was formed at the same time. An understanding of the place and the work of holiness and divine power. A popular Christian identity, which could also have considerable local roots and charisma. After all, the most insignificant community, every village, could have its own martyria, in which local martyrs, or perhaps also the relics of saints who were recognized throughout the empire, were venerated, which had been transferred here. The veneration of martyrs was thus at the same time a decisive force for the formation of a Christian topography in the towns and rural regions of the empire. The constant proliferation of Christian sacred sites, that translation, that means the ceremonial transfer of martyrs' relics to new places of veneration, the attendance of martyrs' festivals, the processions organized on these occasions, the emerging pilgrimage movement with its high expectations of the staging of the sacred sites visited, and based on all this, the formation of station liturgies, similar to those that arose in the Holy Land, gave rise to a rapidly growing network of cult sites. Individual bishops made virtuoso use of the instrument of establishing martyr cult sites and martyr festivals in order to strengthen their congregations, but also to expand their personal influence and power in the region. However, the overwhelming success, indeed triumph, of martyr worship in the 4th century was not unchallenged, and it is revealing that here the celebrations were the focus of critics. When Commodian encouraged believers to go to the martyrs' graves to chill, refrigerare, an ambiguous word that can be translated as to cool down, then the context makes it clear that he was pursuing spiritual goals here. But other motives, such as participation in the refrigerium, the celebration of the dead with a funerary banquet, could also be underlying. Already the pre-Constantinian Church had reviewed the funeral celebration of its faithful in the cemeteries with suspicion and had diagnosed them as the performance of pagan customs, if not worse. In the canons of the Council of Elvira around 306 or 312 AD, just before Constantine or around Constantine, believers are forbidden to light candles over the graves on the ground that this is a pagan practice and harms the souls of the buried. The sanction for contravention is excommunication. This is Canon 34. Women are forbidden to spend the nights in cemeteries to keep the night vigil because, I quote, they often commit crimes, scelerat, instead of praying. Canon 35, however, does not tell us which scelerat the bishops here had in mind. We should always be aware and keep in mind that no other great religion is as obsessively concerned with death as Christianity. And this is figured or is mirrored in the veneration of relics as well and martyrs. The frequent visits of the cemeteries by the Christians met with alienation and rejection in their environment. Emperor Julian brought up as a Christian, but then a vehement advocate of classical paganism and critic of Christian doctrine, thus speaks of the old women who hang around the tombs and reproaches Christians as a whole. You populate the tombs and memorials. But there was also criticism within the church of the practices associated with the veneration of martyrs. The presbyter Vigilantius wrote against a whole series of practices in the cult of martyrs. His treatise is lost to us and can only be found reflected in a refutation by Jerome. Jerome quotes him as saying, "We see how almost pagan customs are introduced into the church under the pretext of worshipping God. While the sun is still shining, whole masses of candles are lit." Vigilantius also attacked Christians worshipping relics as ash worshippers and idolaters, cinerari et idololatri, and condemned the nocturnal vigils at martyr shrines. Pagan practices at the martyr's grave may have upset clerics. However, alarmed were representatives of the church hierarchy by the openly morally offensive behavior of Christians during the celebrations of at the tombs, by the blatant excesses that apparently occurred regularly at these holy places. To quote the Coptic archimandrite Shenuti again, people not only chat, eat, drink, laugh. No, they hurt and murder. Drunkenness, debauchery, and quarreling reign everywhere. While communion is celebrated and psalms are sung in the church, cymbals and flutes resound outside. Above all, the gathering of the many people is used to do business. Some sell honey, others cattle. Even the vice of the grossest sensuality is worshipped in the holy place. Old and young anoint their heads and make up their eyes when they go to the chapel of the martyr. The graves and the dark corners of the church can testify to the many who have succumbed to the temptation of forbidden company. He means intercourse here. Here, the scelerat, the crimes Christians committed at the tombs, are elaborated in desirable detail, which the canons of Elvira, quoted before, had still withheld from us. However, it is problematic to denote the opulent feasts, the consumption of alcohol, the music and songs at the martyrs' graves as excesses, not only because they were in the tradition of the refrigeria, which in turn were in the tradition of the funerary banquets practiced by all ancient cult groups. The joy of celebration, the exuberance and the enjoyment of life articulated here, even if they contradicted the strict morals preached in the church, they still corresponded to the social expectations of the wider environment, the family, the group, the local community. The church was faced with the choice of suppressing this way of life, diverting it and molding it in own tolerated forms, or re-educating the faithful, so to speak, as John Chrysostom tried and failed to do. The debate about the culture of celebration in the martyria was by no means confined to church leaders and clerics. Augustine, Bishop of Hippo, in a letter to his friend and colleague Alypius of Tagaste, reports how he had to contend with his own congregation when he tried in sermons to dissuade the faithful from their traditional banquets at the martyrium of Leontios, after all, the former bishop of the diocese of Hippo. During the service, the congregation countered him, "Why now? Those who did not forbid it in the past were also Christians." In order not to reproach his predecessors, who had not dared to forbid this bad custom, he reacted, as he reports to his fellow bishop, as follows. Oops, that's wrong. Sorry for this. I have to go back. no, sorry, there's again, hang on. Yes. I explained to them the emergence in the church that apparently caused this abuse. For when peace came after so much and so fierce persecution, the pagans would have desired in droves to take the Christian name. But their habit of spending the feast days with their idols, eating copiously and drinking excessively, prevented them from doing so, and it was extremely difficult to keep them away from these highly pernicious but ancient pleasures. Then our ancestors would have thought it good to take this weakness into partial consideration and allowed them to celebrate other festivals in honor of the holy martyrs, not with similar sacrilege, but with similar luxury, instead of the feast days they had abandoned. Augustine, initially an opponent of the veneration of martyrs, later strove to capture the popular practice and carefully bring it into a form acceptable to and controllable by the church. This included a lively and popular design of the martyr liturgy and the public reading of the martyrdom report. Above all, he was aware that the veneration of local martyrs could strengthen the identity of congregations and even establish it in competition with other groups. He thinks, of course, of the Donatists with their strong martyr cult. The common celebration at the grave, although eyed suspiciously by the church hierarchy, offered with the funeral banquet, which could take place on the anniversary of the martyr, but also on other holidays, an effective alternative to private funeral banquets in the community, and especially to the cult banquets of the Donatists, who competed with the Catholics, and to their excessive cult of martyrdom. I said that before. Thus, even vigils, nocturnal gatherings at the martyr's grave, were again tolerated, although Augustine insisted that the previously sole Easter vigil was the Mater Omnium Vigiliarum, the mother of all nightly celebrations. Sorry, too early. Augustine's testimony, which at the same time gives us insight into the attitude of his congregation in the question of celebrating at the martyr's grave, makes clear how contentious the veneration of martyrs or its modalities could be between the church hierarchy and the simple faithful, how the latter defended their customs, their form of celebration. Not all ecclesiastical authors take such an empathetic view, but rather convey a very different picture of the practice of martyr veneration. Around 440, Theodoretus, bishop of Cyrus, sketches the following picture of the life at the shrines of the martyrs in his diocese. The temples no longer exist, or have been transformed into churches dedicated to the memory of Christian martyrs. Instead of the Hellenic feasts, now the feasts of Peter, Paul, Thomas, Mauritius, and others are celebrated, not in the boisterous manner of the former popular festivals, but with heart-rending joy and deep emotion, with edifying sermons and pious songs. And in place of the former processions, offensive behavior and speech, simple gatherings are now celebrated without boozing, dancing, or laughter, but with divine hymns, listening to holy words and prayer, accompanied by touching tears. Are we dealing with better, more devout Christians in Eastern Syria? Or has the official church succeeded in the 4 decades that have passed since Augustine's letter in promoting missionary work and the moral improvement of the population so effectively? Certainly not. Theodoretus' account is rather indebted to the agenda of his writing, which seeks to document the overcoming and healing of pagan errors. That's the title of his tract. The bishop like many other Christian authors of the time, is guided by a teleological view of history that considers the triumph of Christianity inevitable and already presents it as a reality to his contemporaries. The practice of venerating martyrs, however, the funeral banquets and their joy of life, was and remained different. This form of expression of popular piety held true against all ecclesiastical efforts. The critical distance, sometimes even open rejection of martyr worships by part of the church hierarchy, had not only to do with the celebrations at the martyrs' graves, their supposed pagan roots and practices, and the immorality of the participants at the funeral banquets. Martyrs possessed an unchallengeable authority, and as intercessors of the faithful with God and mediators of salvation, a charisma of their own, which they had acquired by dying for their faith, and which was thus independent of the official church. The promise of salvation associated with them, their direct access to the divine, implicitly placed them in a competitive situation with clergy and episcopate. The latter, therefore, made every effort to bring their cult, the places of worship, and the forms of their worship under control. However, the martyr cult of the 4th century proved to be an unprecedented religious grassroots movement, and martyr shrines were established everywhere. Have they always buried only martyrs? Asked our Abbot Shenute angrily in Upper Egypt when his monks proudly told him about the discovery of a new corpse. And a papyrus of late 4th century claims that Egypt had produced and venerated exactly 83,721 martyrs. Religious sentiment, the cultic need of the general population, but not always theological reflection, are responsible for many of the innovations in late antique Christianity. The martyr cult is indeed mentioned here in first place. The unwavering adherence of the simple believers to the banquet for the dead and the feasts at the martyr's grave can be explained, this should be noted in conclusion, by a simple fact. According to general understanding, one did not celebrate one's deceased or a martyr at the grave. One celebrated with them. The dead were understood as living participants in the meal. Here, therefore, one dined with the martyr, cultivated a personal relationship with him, shared food and drink, made every conceivable effort for this occasion. Here, one had to celebrate. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very, very much for this very interesting and illuminating presentation paper, Professor Hahn. I'm sure that there will be many questions from our online audience. That includes colleagues, students, people from all over the world. Cyprus, Greece, Germany. I can recognize many of dear colleagues and students. So I switch off the